Welcome back, everybody, to another adventure of Mr. Kelly Puts You to Sleep. Today we'll be discussing the riveting topic of cellular respiration, both an overview and a more in detail look like we did with photosynthesis. So what exactly is cellular respiration? So cellular respiration is a process by which glucose molecules are broken down to release energy. So when we talk about photosynthesis, the entire point of photosynthesis was to convert solar energy and store that energy in the glucose molecule. But once again, the end result is your cells need ATP. So cellular respiration is that process of taking that energy that was stored in the glucose molecule and converting that energy to being stored into the ATP molecule, which then your cell can use to actually power itself. So specifically, we are looking at something called aerobic cellular respiration today. So aerobic as in is using air. It's using oxygen. Most of aerobic cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. Within aerobic cellular respiration, a total of 36 ATP molecules are produced for each one of the glucose molecules that are broken down. And I usually don't test you on numbers, but that number I do actually want you to memorize. So I do expect you to know that for every one glucose molecule, 36 ATP molecules are actually produced. And if we look at the general formula for aerobic cellular respiration, we see that it is a glucose molecule plus 6 oxygen molecules are broken down into 6 CO2 molecules plus 6 H2O molecules and 36 ATP. In other words, glucose plus oxygen becomes CO2, carbon dioxide, plus water, and then energy in the form of ATP. And if you look very closely, you notice that the formula for aerobic cellular respiration is almost the exact opposite of the formula for photosynthesis. So they're very similar processes in terms of what goes in one comes out of the other. However, one deals with solar energy and the other one deals with converting that energy into ATP molecules. Here we can see the actual 3 steps that are involved in aerobic cellular respiration. So the first one actually does not occur within the mitochondria. The first step is known as glycolysis, which we'll go over in a second, which happens in the cytoplasm. And then that products of glycolysis enter the mitochondria and then enters the cycle known as the Krebs cycle. And then from there, that energy is transferred to the electron transport chain, and each step creates some ATP. And we'll go over each one of these in a little more detail. So now let's go over cellular respiration in a little more detail. I just showed you this diagram. So the first step is known as glycolysis, and lysis means to break down. So glycolysis literally means the breakdown of glucose. And you're taking that 1,6 carbon sugar, glucose, C6, and you're splitting it perfectly into 2 3 carbon sugars known as pyruvate. So it takes place in the cytoplasm, and it's the only step of cellular respiration that takes place in the cytoplasm. And this process produces 2 ATP molecules. So the entire process of aerobic cellular respiration produces 36. This first step only produces 2, net 2. It actually makes 4, but to start the process it requires 2. So therefore the net gain after glycolysis is only 2. The second step is known as the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. So this is the first process. So the pyruvate that comes out of glycolysis is then moved into the mitochondria, and from there that pyruvate is broken down further through the Krebs or citric acid cycle, producing more ATP. This step requires oxygen. This is the step why you need to breathe. So that first step, glycolysis, is anaerobic. It does not require oxygen, while the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle requires oxygen for it to continue and for it to actually become a cycle and finish its cycle. So as I said, this process is taking that pyruvate molecule and breaking it down further all the way back to that CO2 molecule that originally entered the plant. So all of that work that plant did in taking those CO2 molecules and fixing them together to form that glucose molecule, the Krebs cycle has completely undone that. It takes that pyruvate molecule after it's already been broken down or after it's already been created through glycolysis and breaks it down even further and releases CO2. So this is why we say this is the step where that CO2 from cellular respiration is actually created. It's created in this Krebs cycle, in this citric acid cycle, and that is the CO2 that you breathe out. This cycle also produces only 2 ATP, and more importantly, it produces these high energy electrons. And these high energy electrons are going to move on to the third and final stage of the aerobic cellular respiration, and that is where the majority of the ATP is actually going to be produced. So the first step, glycolysis, only produced 2 ATP total. This second step produces 2 ATP, which means this third step, really, that's where we're going to get most of our ATP production from, and that is where these high energy electrons are going to move on, and it's going to enter what is called the electron transport chain. So this is the actual citric acid cycle. If you ever take a biochemistry class in college, if you want to be a doctor or anything in the biology related, you unfortunately would have to memorize all of these steps, but most of you will never see this diagram again in your life, let alone actually have to memorize the individual components like I had to. As you can see, it's a very complex cycle, isocitrate, alpha-ketoglutarate, succinyl-CoA, but thankfully you do not need to understand any of this for anything in my class ever. So those high energy electrons are then transferred to the final part of the aerobic cellular respiration process, which is known as the electron transport chain, because you're talking about transporting electrons, or the ETC. This process also occurs in the mitochondria. It also requires oxygen, so that is, once again, why we breathe in oxygen is for the Krebs cycle, the second part, and also for this third part, the electron transport chain. And what's actually happening is these electrons are being passed along a series of proteins. And as they're being passed along, they're slowly losing some energy. And we're using that energy to actually pump hydrogen ions, to pump protons against the concentration gradient. So we're actually using this energy to do active transport, which we'll see on the next slide in a diagram, which will make more sense. At the very end of this chain, so after all of these electrons have been passed along, they eventually are added to hydrogen and oxygen to form water. So if we go back to the equation for cellular respiration, CO2 and water are produced. The CO2 is produced from the Krebs cycle, from the breaking down of that pyruvate, of that glucose molecule, and then the water is actually produced from the end result of this electron transport chain. So once these electrons have lost most of their energy, they're thrown back with hydrogen and oxygen to form a water molecule. This is where you're getting most of your ATP production from. So the electron transport chain, as you can see, is producing 32 ATP compared to only 4 total from the first 2 steps. So steps 1 and 2, glycolysis and Krebs cycle, only produce a measly 4 ATP, while the electron transport chain, the ETC, is producing a whopping 32. So this is what's really required to keep you alive, especially being a multicellular organism, which has a lot more energy requirements than if you were just a simple little bacteria. So we can see this is the actual diagram for the electron transport chain. So we can see here that here's these proteins that are in this membrane. The electrons are being passed along. As the electrons are being passed along down the chain, we are pumping hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient. So we're pumping them from an area of low concentration on this side to an area of high concentration on this side. And the question is, why would we do that? Well, what we're actually going to do is then we're going to allow those hydrogen ions to flow back into the inner part of the mitochondria. So the question is, why would we use energy to pump them out if we're just going to let them back in? Well, what actually happens is as these hydrogen ions are flowing back into the mitochondria, to the inside of the mitochondria, they are passing through this protein, this enzyme known as ATP synthase. And what's actually happening is these hydrogen ions are literally turning a little turbine, just like in an electrical power plant. And as it's turning this little turbine, it's that energy is being used to add that third phosphate group onto ADP to create ATP. So we're pumping out hydrogen ions so that when they rush back in, they turn a little turbine, literally just like how hydroelectric dams work or wind turbines work. And using that energy, we're shoving that phosphate group back on to ADP and creating that high energy ATP that we need. And this is what the electron transport looks like, and that's why it produces the most ATP, because it has this ATP synthase that is allowing the hydrogen ions to flow through it and forcing that third phosphate group back onto ADP to create ATP. So once again, you can see the 3 stages. We have glycolysis, produces a whole whopping 2 ATP. We have the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle, which creates a whopping 2 ATP. And then we have the electron transport chain, where we're passing those electrons down the chain, and that is creating, and then running them back through ATP synthase, which is creating 32 ATP. To reemphasize, and this is very important, the first step of aerobic cellular respiration is actually an anaerobic process. So the first step is known as glycolysis. So if it's anaerobic, it's not using oxygen. So the first step, glycolysis, that breaking of the glucose molecule into 2 pyruvate molecules in the cytoplasm, does not require oxygen. The second 2 steps are where the aerobic part comes in. So if it's aerobic, it's using oxygen, and both the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain require oxygen. So a brief recap, so cellular respiration, the entire point is to take the energy that's stored in glucose and convert that energy and store that energy into an ATP molecule, multiple ATP molecules. So for every 1 glucose molecule, 36 ATP molecules are produced. The first step of that is glycolysis, which does not require oxygen. It actually takes place in the cytoplasm. From there, pyruvate is created. It is then moved into the mitochondria. The Krebs cycle occurs, creates 2 more ATP, breaks down that pyruvate all the way back to CO2. The CO2 is released. That extra electrons are then passed to the electron transport chain. As they're being passed along, that energy is used to pump out hydrogen ions. Once those hydrogen ions are outside, they flood back in through ATP synthase. As it's turning a little turbine, it's using that energy to shove that 3rd phosphate group back onto ADP, and then creating 32 ATP for every 1 glucose molecule that was broken down during glycolysis. So it's as I showed you in the Krebs cycle, it's a very complex process, even more complex than what I just described there. And that is what you need to understand about aerobic cellular respiration. And the next topic will be, well, what happens when we don't have enough air? So what happens when you're exercising and you literally cannot consume enough oxygen for aerobic cellular respiration? How do your cells get enough ATP to actually survive? And that is what anaerobic cellular respiration is about, and the purpose of the next video and your next note section.